You raise them to be strong, but you never expect the day they'll need to be stronger than you. Hey friend, I hope you and your loved ones are safe and warm today, because what I'm about to share with you is the kind of story that wraps itself around your heart and won't let go. It starts not with a bang, but with a whisper printed in bold black letters on thin white paper, eviction notice. I held it in my hands like it might burn straight through my skin. It weighed almost nothing, yet somehow it carried every sleepless night, every sacrificed dream, every prayer I'd whispered in the dark. My name is Ruth Brooks. I've spent my life surviving things I don't talk about, but nothing ever prepared me for the moment I realized the world wanted to take from me the one place I'd tried to protect at all costs, our home. It wasn't much. Paint chipped at the corners, floors that creaked like old knees, a roof that coughed when it rained. But it was ours, and now it was being taken from us. I stood in the kitchen, the notice trembling in my hands, and tried to breathe, tried to figure out what to tell my son. But before I could speak, I felt a quiet strength wrap around my fingers. Isaiah, 17, still growing into his voice, still figuring out how to be a man in a world that often refuses to see boys like him as anything but threats. He didn't say anything at first, just read the paper over my shoulder. I waited for the slump, for the sigh, for that quiet surrender I've seen too many times in people who look like us. But Isaiah didn't shrink. He didn't lower his eyes. Instead, his hand tightened around mine, and when he finally spoke, his voice didn't waver. "This isn't right," he said. I wanted to tell him that right never mattered, that folks like us don't get justice, we get by, that the system wasn't built for families like ours, and trying to fight it would only break him. But then he looked at me, really looked, and said words that changed everything. "I'll fight this. I'll fight for you." I should have stopped him. I should have told him no, told him not to waste his fire on something so much bigger than both of us, told him that this was the real world, where truth is expensive and justice is rarely free. But I didn't. Instead, I laughed, not the kind of laugh that carries joy. No, this one came hollow and raw, like a reflex from too many years of pain. It scraped its way out of my throat and left nothing but silence behind. "You?" I said, rubbing my hand down my face. "Isaiah, what do you think you can do?" He didn't answer right away, didn't get defensive, didn't look away. That made it worse somehow. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, not because I didn't believe in my son, but because I knew what the world could do to boys who believe too much. "You're not a lawyer," I whispered. "You've never even been inside a courtroom. We don't have money. We don't have connections. We can't win this." I wasn't trying to crush him. I was trying to protect him, the way I always had, the way a mother's supposed to. But Isaiah just stood there, still, grounded, like a tree deciding it would not be moved. Then softly, firmly, he said, "You always told me not to let the world define me. Are you really going to stop me from standing now?" And I froze, because I had told him that. I'd said it over and over across years of late-night kitchen talks and long walks home from school. Told him how the world doesn't hand power to people like us, that we have to dig for it, claw for it, earn every ounce of respect we're given. I told him to rise, and now he was. But this wasn't supposed to be his fight. It was mine. I was the mother. I was the one who absorbed the blows, who carried the burdens, who stitched together the broken pieces so he wouldn't have to. And yet, here he stood, offering to carry the weight I had spent my whole life shielding him from. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out, because the truth was I wasn't just scared of losing our home. I was terrified of what it would cost him to try. What would you do if your child wanted to walk into a fight you know isn't fair? Would you protect them? or believe in them. The days that followed blurred together like rain on a window pane, quiet, constant, and heavy. But through the haze, one thing remained unchanged: Isaiah. He barely slept. He barely ate. At first, I told myself it was a phase, one of those bursts of teenage rebellion that would burn out once reality caught up to him. But this wasn't rebellion. It wasn't even defiance. It was purpose. Every night after I dragged my tired body home from the late shift, I'd find him at the same spot. Our chipped old kitchen table, stacks of printed cases, borrowed law books, highlighted statutes spread out like armor across the surface. The overhead bulb flickered overhead, casting tired shadows across his face. His fingers clutched a pen so tight, his knuckles turned pale. His eyes, rimmed red, scanned page after page like his life depended on it. And maybe it did. He wasn't studying like a student. He was preparing like a soldier, like someone who understood the enemy and still chose to walk into battle. I stood outside his door more times than I can count, hand raised to knock, ready to tell him to stop, to say, "You don't have to do this. This isn't your burden. Let me carry it." But the words never came, because each time just before I could knock, I heard it. The rustle of pages, the scratch of pen on paper, the low murmur of his voice repeating legal terms no 17-year-old should have to memorize just to keep a roof over his head. And so I didn't knock. I didn't stop him. I watched. Have you ever watched someone you love carry a burden too heavy for them? Did you try to stop them or let them keep going? One night I found him asleep at the table, head resting on an open book, notes scattered like feathers across the wood. His hand still gripped a pen like he'd fallen asleep mid-thought. My heart broke and swelled all at once. He looked so young, too young to be carrying all this weight. But he wasn't carrying it alone anymore. Not really. I reached for the thin blanket hanging off the back of the chair and laid it gently over his shoulders. And I stood there, just for a moment, watching him breathe. That was the night something in me changed. I stopped telling him to rest. I stopped trying to pull him away from the storm. Instead, I started to stand beside him. I used to believe my job was to protect him, to keep him from pain, from failure, from the weight of a world that never seemed to run out of ways to bruise us. But something shifted in me the night I covered Isaiah with that blanket. Maybe it was the way his face, even in sleep, held onto resolve. Maybe it was the pages, dog-eared, highlighted, nearly torn from hours of turning. Or maybe it was the simple truth that I couldn't stop him. So I started helping him instead, not in big, sweeping gestures. I didn't have legal knowledge. I couldn't rewrite the law or march into court with arguments etched in fire. But I could bring him tea. I could set a plate of food beside his laptop. His eyes never lifted, but the plate was always empty later. I could rest my hand on his back when his fingers trembled from too much coffee and not enough sleep, pressing just enough to say, "I see you. Keep going." And on the worst nights, when the frustration cracked through his voice, when the notes he'd studied for hours refused to make sense, I stood beside him, not with answers, just with presence. There's a kind of faith that doesn't need words. It's the kind that comes in silence, in the quiet click of a kettle, in a folded blanket, in the warmth of a hand on a weary shoulder. And without realizing it, my fear began to shift. I still worried. Lord knows I worried more than ever. But that worry was no longer trying to stop him. It was walking with him. I didn't tell him to give up anymore, because somewhere in the hours between dusk and dawn, I had come to believe, quietly, stubbornly, fiercely, that maybe, just maybe, he could do it. I held Isaiah's hand as we walked through the courthouse doors, not because I believed we'd win, not because I thought justice would greet us with open arms. I held his hand because I was afraid of the judge who might smirk, afraid of the lawyers with expensive suits and louder voices, afraid of a system that had never made room for people like us, and now watched us with thinly veiled irritation. The courtroom was colder than I expected. The polished floors gleamed like ice. The judge's bench towered above us like an altar where decisions were handed down, not discussed. Whispers curled through the air like smoke, shuffling papers, coughs half covered. But it was the eyes that pierced, dozens of them, some curious, most dismissive. They didn't need to say it, I could feel it. What's he doing here? Is this some kind of joke? They don't really think they have a chance, do they? Across the aisle, the opposing attorney sat with a confidence born from generations of not having to question his place. His suit fit like power, his smirk curved like a blade. And the judge? He didn't even look at us when he called the case. Just flipped through papers, sighed, and finally lifted his eyes to Isaiah, pausing for less than a second, long enough to register surprise, maybe even mild annoyance, before moving on. I gripped Isaiah's hand tighter. Everything in me screamed to protect him, to turn around, to whisper, "Let's go home," to save him from the laughter I knew was coming. But before I could speak, he let go of my hand. He stood. His chair scraped against the floor, sharp, jarring. Every head turned, and there he was, 17, alone, standing where no one expected him to belong. The room tensed. The judge leaned back, fingers tapping idly on the bench. The opposing lawyer barely hid his amusement. I could hear it in the chuckles that rippled behind us. I could feel it in the way the room tilted, not in our favor. And still, Isaiah stood. The room didn't erupt, not all at once. It started with a soft chuckle, then another, and soon it swelled, low, dismissive, contagious. They weren't laughing because he'd said something funny. They were laughing because he dared to speak, because to them, Isaiah wasn't a voice, he was a mistake. The judge didn't join in, but his lips curled ever so slightly, the kind of twitch that said, "Let's get this over with." Across the room, the opposing attorney leaned back, smug and relaxed. "Son," he said, adjusting his tie with theatrical ease, "this isn't a classroom debate. Do you even know what you're doing?" My stomach clenched. I knew this moment would come, had braced myself for it, but knowing it didn't soften the blow. They weren't just laughing at his words. They were laughing at his existence in that space. What would you do if an entire room laughed at your child just for speaking up? Would you pull them back or let them stand tall? I wanted to pull him back, to whisper, "Let's go," before they tear you apart. But I couldn't move because Isaiah hadn't. He stood firm, didn't shrink, didn't tremble, didn't blink. And then he spoke. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "under the Tenant Protection Act, an eviction notice must meet specific legal requirements. This one does not." The room didn't fall silent right away. The laughter tripped, stumbled. Some chuckles cut off halfway. A few turned into awkward throat clearings, and then slowly, the silence crept in. The judge, who had barely lifted his eyes before, now raised his brow. The opposing lawyer sat up just a bit. Isaiah flipped a page. "Furthermore," he continued, "per Section 1946.2, a landlord must provide just cause. No such cause has been cited." He said it like someone who didn't need them to believe, he only needed them to hear. I watched the shift, tiny but unmistakable. The judge's fingers stilled. The opposing attorney's jaw tightened. No one was laughing anymore, and for the first time since this began, the doubt in the room wasn't on us. It was on them. The opposing attorney recovered quickly. Too quickly. He smoothed his papers, leaned forward like a man settling into his throne. "That's a nice interpretation, son," he said, tapping his pen with rhythm. "But under Section 1954.53 of the Rent Control Act, landlords have the right to evict under discretionary cause, if notice is given," which it was. He lifted the eviction notice between two fingers, like a man revealing his final card. His voice oozed confidence. His smirk returned, and for a moment, even I faltered. It sounded right. It sounded legal. It sounded final. But Isaiah didn't move, didn't blink. "That's incorrect," he replied calmly. No theatrics, no raised voice, just fact. Section 1954.53 only applies to rent-controlled properties under pre-1995 statutes. This unit was built in 2003. That clause doesn't apply. A pause. The smirk twitched, flattened, flickered. Across the room, the lawyer rifled through his papers faster now, not to clarify, to confirm, but the silence spoke louder than any argument. The judge tilted his head. A spectator leaned in, and in that stillness, something became very, very clear. This boy didn't come to play. He came to win. Have you ever seen someone you love step into their power right when it mattered most? What did it feel like? Isaiah didn't raise his voice, didn't puff his chest. He simply flipped back a page in his notes, ran his finger down the eviction notice, and stopped. "Your Honor," he said steadily, "this notice is invalid." The opposing attorney chuckled again, forced, hollow. "Nice try, kid. But that document meets every requirement under the law." Isaiah didn't flinch. He turned the paper so the judge could see. Tapped a single line. "By statute, no-fault evictions require a 60-day notice. This one only gives 30. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was surgical, clean, sharp, cutting through the room like the drop of a pin in a cathedral. The judge leaned forward. He adjusted his glasses, read the line, then read it again. And just like that, the power in the room shifted. Across the aisle, the attorney sat upright. The edge of confidence peeled away. His fingers flicked through his copy of the document with mounting speed, searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. "Is this accurate?" the judge asked, his voice now cool and precise. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Well, technically," the judge repeated, tone sharpening like a blade. That was all it took, because suddenly the judge wasn't glancing at Isaiah like a nuisance. He was studying him. The gallery, once filled with quiet doubt, now leaned in. The smirks were gone. The whispers had stopped. And in that stillness, my son, my 17-year-old son, stood at the center of it all, not just surviving the moment, but commanding it. The judge leaned back in his chair slowly. His fingers no longer shuffled papers. They folded, deliberate, thoughtful, like he was settling into the weight of something he didn't expect to feel that day: respect. "Mr. Brooks," he said, his voice no longer bored, "do you understand that you've just accomplished something most licensed attorneys failed to do?" There was a hush, a real reverent hush. A few heads turned. Whispers flickered like candlelight. But Isaiah didn't shift. He didn't gloat. He didn't even smile. He just stood there, quiet, grounded, ready. And me? I broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but the tears came all the same, soft and hot, blurring the edges of my world. I wasn't crying because we'd won. I was crying because, for the first time in his young life, the world stopped to see him, really see him, not as a kid, not as someone to dismiss, not as noise, but as a voice that had earned its place in that room. This wasn't just about a legal technicality. It wasn't even about the roof we might get to keep over our heads. It was about what I saw happen in real time. The opposing attorney no longer cocky, the judge no longer distracted, the gallery no longer amused, but all of them listening to him, to my son. And in that moment, everything we had endured, every doubt, every night of silence, every trembling hand over a stack of law books, it was all worth it. The courthouse doors swung open behind us, and I stepped into the afternoon light like someone learning how to breathe again. The air felt different, not softer, stronger. The fear that had lived in my chest for months didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip. For the first time in a long time, the ground beneath my feet didn't feel like it might give way. I looked over at Isaiah. He hadn't changed, still 17. Still the boy I'd raised with calloused hands and whispered prayers, but something in the way he stood was different. He was taller now, not in inches, but in presence. And then he reached for my hand, just like he had the day the notice arrived. He gave it a gentle squeeze and said, his voice quiet but certain, "Mom, I'm going to be a lawyer." I turned to him, studied his face, the boy who once clung to my leg in crowded rooms, the boy I taught how to tie his shoes and guard his heart. And now he was talking about courtrooms, about justice, about fighting not just for himself, but for others like us. And this time, I didn't hesitate. "I know you will," I whispered, and I meant it. As we stepped down those courthouse steps, the world hadn't changed, but my world had. Not just because we were keeping our home, not just because we had won a case no one believed we could, but because for the first time I believed in something more than survival. I believed in truth, in courage, in Isaiah. He didn't just speak for us, he spoke for every family told they don't matter, for every mother who's ever been afraid to hope, for every child who's ever been underestimated. And I knew in my bones, he wasn't done yet. Not even close. Did this story remind you of someone in your life? Someone who rose up when the world expected them to fold? If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, drop a comment. What would you do to protect your family? And most of all, subscribe to our channel, Black Women, where we share stories that remind the world what courage looks like when it's tired, underfunded, and still refuses to back down. Because justice isn't just a courtroom word. It's a choice, it's a voice, it's you, it's us. And sometimes it starts with one boy who wouldn't sit down,